Hey everyone, welcome to How to Play Warhammer 40K 7th Edition. As always, my name is Jay, and welcome to the next part of my in-depth series in which I will be discussing the movement phase, which happens after the reserve phase in a typical turn of Warhammer 40K 7th Edition. So the movement phase is relatively simple of a phase, but it can be quite complicated at the same time. The reason being is that the way you move models is actually quite easy. There's only really two circumstances that you have to think about, but there are a lot of different distances that a model could potentially move based on what unit type it is. So as I mentioned in the previous video, if you want to find out what unit type a model is, it is in their codex entry. And as I said, there's a bunch of different types, and I'll be going over most of them in this video of Warhammer 40K 7th Edition. So let's get started, shall we? So, the first thing that you need to know in Warhammer 40K 7th Edition is that movement is measured in inches. Typically, 6 inches is a normal movement for a normal infantry. And most of the models in Warhammer 40K are infantry, so they each get to move up to 6 inches per turn. That being said, you don't actually have to move the full distance, but you can just move up to that amount. So for normal standard infantry, like this Terminator here, they can move up to 6 inches in the movement phase. Providing they're not locked in combat, they're not pinned, they haven't gone to ground. There's a few reasons that will prevent someone from moving. And the most common reason that you can't move during the movement phase is that you're currently locked in combat. And I'll be discussing that in the combat phase, the assault phase, in a future video. But as I said, so essentially there are two types of movement in Warhammer 40K 7th Edition. The first one is movement through open ground. What open ground means is that you're not currently moving through terrain that is described as difficult terrain. So, if you're moving along the table, like you can clearly see here, there's no terrain underneath it. It is just normal movement through open ground, in which you just simply measure your distance and you move the model accordingly. Now, the other important thing that you must know in Warhammer 40K 7th Edition is that movement happens from the front of the base to the front of the base. That is how you measure your distance. So if I want to move this Terminator, I simply measure out 6 inches from the front of the base, and I move that model accordingly up to the 6-inch mark, once again to the front of the base. You only measure from front of the base to front of the base. It is a very straightforward measurement system. The second type of movement is movement involving terrain. So it could be moving into terrain, moving out of terrain, and moving through terrain if you're already in it and you want to just keep moving through terrain. Movement through terrain is different for most models in Warhammer 40K 7th Edition. For most models, if you have to move into, out of, or through terrain, it's called movement through terrain. And you simply roll 2 dice, and you can take up to the highest number on the dice. So if you roll 2 dice, like so, and the highest number is a 5, that model or squad can move up to 5 inches. Now, if you decide that you're going to try to move into terrain, you have to do this roll. So you roll 2d6, and you can move up to the highest dice in distance. That being said, once you choose to move into terrain, if you roll your 2 dice and you don't like the number, you cannot choose then to move as normal. You have to take the result of the dice for your movement for that particular phase. And as I mentioned before, you don't actually have to move that exact distance. You can move up to. So if you roll 2 dice, as I mentioned, and the highest is a 5, you can move up to 5 inches. You don't have to move 5 inches exactly. Also, when moving through terrain, some models have a rule called move through cover. And what that means is you get an additional dice. So you get to roll 3 dice instead of 2 dice. And once again, you can take the highest result and move up to that in inches during that movement phase. Also, it should also be worth noting that if you're moving between levels of a building, it is considered 3 inches. So when moving through from one level to the next, you have to roll because you're moving through terrain. And if you get a 3 or higher, you can move 1 level up. And if you roll 6, you can actually move 2 levels up because each level is considered 3 inches of measurement. Another important factor that you must consider when moving models in the movement phase is coherency. I did mention coherency in the deployment video, but essentially what that means is if you're moving a squad of models, regardless of what type they are, you got to keep them in coherency. It means a model has to be at most 2 inches away from the closest model in that squad. So the most they can be away from each other is 2 inches between one model and another model within that squad. If you find yourself starting the phase outside of coherency, if for example your opponent has killed some members of the squad and they're no longer in coherency, you have to move back into coherency during the movement phase if possible. Another important factor that you want to consider when moving multiple models at a time in a squad is that you don't actually have to move all the members of the squad. If you want to keep a particular member of the squad stationary to score an objective or to help in the shooting phase, because some guns in the game of Warhammer 40K 7th edition are affected of whether or not you moved. Most likely a heavy weapon, so if you move with a heavy weapon, it's much harder to hit your opponent. Or salvo weapons, where if you move, you get less shots and at a shorter range. So you may not want to move that particular member of the squad. So as long as you move your squad and they finish in coherency, you don't have to move any member of the squad you don't want to, and you can move anyone you do. So for example, for this squad of 5 Grey Knights moving through cover, I can choose to not move the side cannon and move the other 4 members of the squad closer to get a better shot at the opponent, but the side cannon will remain stationary, and therefore in the shooting phase, it will not be affected by moving. Moving is determined on an individual basis and not on a squad basis. So now that I've covered the 2 types of movement through open ground and movement involving terrain, I'm now going to be going over a bunch of different unit types that are available in Warhammer 40K 7th edition and to show you how each one interacts with both movement through open ground and movement through terrain. Sometimes models have the ability to jump across the battlefield if they're in open ground, and sometimes models can end up dying as a result of moving through terrain if they are certain types. So let's go over the various unit types and discuss how they can move through open ground and how they can move through terrain. So, as I mentioned, the most common unit type is infantry. Infantry can move 6 inches if they're going through open ground, and they can roll 2 dice and take the highest and move up to that when moving through terrain. So if I want to move this Terminator, as I said, if he's in open ground, up to 6 inches, and through terrain, 2d6, take the highest, move up to that distance in inches. That's pretty much infantry. And as I said, the most common is infantry, so that is the most common distance. Another unit type are bikes or jet bikes. For example, this knob biker here, he's on a motorcycle, and motorcycles have a really cool ability, just like the other bikes that are jet bikes. They can again fly through the battlefield. And what they can do is they get to move up to 12 inches rather than the normal 6, because they're much faster. And they're not slowed by terrain whatsoever. So they get to move up to 12 inches in the movement phase regardless of if they're moving into terrain, out of terrain, or through open ground. So that's a great benefit. However, if a bike has to enter, leave, or move through terrain during a movement phase, it is treated as dangerous terrain. And what dangerous terrain means is he has to take a dangerous terrain check, just like I mentioned in the previous video. So for each member of the squad that moves through terrain, you have to roll a d6. On a 1, that model takes a wound, but normal armor saves apply. So if this non-biker happens to move through terrain and I roll a 2 up, he's okay. But if I roll a 1, he takes a wound and has his normal 4+ armor save to hopefully prevent that wound. There's also a type of bike called jet bikes. For example, these Eldar jet bikes. They actually have the ability to once again move 12 inches during the movement phase regardless of if they're going through terrain, but they are essentially flying over the battlefield. So they can actually move 12 inches over other models or over terrain and land on the other side. That being said, they cannot finish their movement on top of another model or on top of impassable terrain. Furthermore, if they finish their movement on top of terrain, it is once again a dangerous terrain test, and on a 1, they take a wound with normal armor saves applying. The next type of model that we're going to be covering is jump infantry. For example, this Storm Boy or this member of the Grey Knights army. They both have jump packs, which is pretty fun. So they get to strap jump packs on their backs and fly across the battlefield. Jump infantry are very similar to bikes in the sense that they can move up to 12 inches if they choose to use their jump pack. Now, they don't have to use their jump pack. They can move just like normal infantry up to 6 inches if they want. But if they choose to use their jump pack, they can actually move 12 inches over intervening models or terrain if they wish. That being said, once again, if they begin or end their movement in terrain, it is a dangerous terrain check. On a roll 1, they take a wound with normal armor saves applying. Another type of model, similar to jump packs, but a little bit different, are jetpack infantry. And the most common army you see jetpack infantry is Tau. For example, this stealth suit right here. He actually moves like normal infantry. And though jetpack infantry looks similar to jump pack infantry, it is a bit different. They can't move up to 12 inches. They can only move up to 6 inches in the movement phase. However, they get to jump around in the assault phase, which will be coming up in a future video. If they just move a normal 6 inches, they can use their jetpack to jump over intervening models or terrain. Once again, if they use their jetpack and they finish or begin their movement phase in terrain, dangerous terrain check, possibly could die. Another unit type, beasts. Beasts are a really fun unit type to use in Warhammer 40K 7th edition. They're very fast, and really not much slows them down. For example, these Necron Scarabs are beasts. And the cool thing about beasts is that they are once again not slowed down by difficult terrain, but they don't take dangerous terrain checks either. So they are safe regardless of moving through terrain, unless it's dangerous terrain. But that's a different story altogether, which will be covered in a future video. But as I said, so they can move through terrain without being slowed down and without taking dangerous terrain checks. So beasts are a lot of fun in Warhammer 40K 7th edition. Another unit type, which you don't see very often, only a couple armies have access to it, is cavalry. The most common are Thunderwolf cavalry for the Space Wolves, and demons also have some cavalry. Cavalry are essentially guys riding on top of animals. So once again, they act similar to beasts in the sense that they're not slowed down by difficult terrain, and they can move up to 12 inches in the movement phase, regardless of if they're moving through terrain or not. However, they do treat all terrain as dangerous, so if you're on top of an animal, you shouldn't be charging through terrain because you might cause a wound to yourself. Another type of unit is monstrous creatures. Monstrous creatures act just as normal infantry. So for example, this Trigon here is a monstrous creature, but he just simply moves 6 inches in the movement phase because he is treated as just being a normal infantry. However, they can add different types of models on top of the monstrous creature. For example, you can have jump pack monstrous creatures, in which they simply act like jump pack infantry. So they can move up to 12 inches, and if they begin or end their movement phase in terrain, dangerous terrain check. You can also have a type of monstrous creature called flying monstrous creatures, and these have wings. For example, this Hive Tyrant with wings. He is a flying monstrous creature, and they're a little bit more complicated, the movement phase with them. They have 2 modes, swooping and gliding. So the first phase we'll go over is gliding. Now gliding is essentially the equivalent of jump pack monstrous creatures. So they're treated as normal jump pack infantry, and they can move up to 12 inches, and as I mentioned before, dangerous terrain check, beginning or ending in their movement phase in dangerous terrain or in terrain. It's treated as dangerous. However, the other type is called swooping. Now swooping allows a monstrous creature to move between 12 and 24 inches in the movement phase. So essentially, a swooping monstrous creature can fly across the battlefield. And not only that, they are extremely hard to hit, which we'll be going over in the shooting phase. They're much harder to hit because they're flying around the battlefield, but they cannot assault. That is a penalty of swooping. They can't be assaulted unless they are landed, which I'll be discussing that once again in a future video. There's a lot to cover in this series of Warhammer 40K 7th edition. When moving a swooping monstrous creature, you can begin by pivoting up to 90 degrees in any direction, left or right. And then you can move between 12 and 24 inches in that direction. Also, swooping monstrous creatures have the ability to leave the battlefield altogether. That is crazy. And if they leave the battlefield, they go in ongoing reserve and come in automatically the following turn. And the last type that I'll be discussing are vehicles. However, there's so many special rules that apply to vehicles. I'm going to do a specific video solely on vehicles because they are very different than most infantry and other unit types. Depending on how you move them, it changes how you can fire. So I decided that it's better to go through the movement phase and shooting phase videos first, and then eventually do a video solely on vehicles, because that way you'll have all the knowledge you can up to that point, and it'll be much easier to understand vehicle movement at that time. And that's essentially the movement phase in a nutshell. So as I said, essentially there's two types: movement on open ground and movement through terrain. Most models move 6 inches because most models are infantry. However, jump infantry, bikes, beasts, cavalry can move up to 12 inches in the movement phase, and most of them are not slowed down by terrain. Infantry are slowed down by terrain, so you move 2d, so you roll 2d6, you can take the highest number, and you can move up to that amount in inches. If the models have a rule called move through cover, they get an additional dice, but they still have to take the highest dice, and they can move up to that amount in inches in the battlefield. Movement is measured from the front of the base to the front of base at all times, so you can never measure from the front to the back or the back to the front. And that's essentially it. As I said, I'll be doing a full video on vehicles in a few more videos, because I want to cover the shooting phase first before covering vehicles in depth, because depending on how you move vehicles, they can fire different weapons at different times and different ballistic skills. So I want to go into more detail on other things before going back to vehicles. So that's it. Thank you very much for watching this episode of How to Play Warhammer 40K 7th Edition. I really hope you enjoyed a lot and learned a lot. And if I've left anything out, or if you have anything else to add to the discussion, leave a comment in the comment section down below. It is very much welcome. And together we will teach all the new people about Warhammer 40K 7th Edition. So thank you very much once again for watching. Until next time, this is Jay saying, happy painting.